afternoon, everyone. My name is Laurie Gagan, and I am your host today on the wellnesscrusaders.com on KMMU.org internet radio station. Today, again, I'm quite honored. I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Richard Fleming on his newest books. Are we the next endangered species? Bioweapons, eugenics, and more. And normally, I don't really get into talking about politics on my station. But tonight, we're going to mention just a few things on really what happened on the debate and where President Trump, RFK, and Dr. Richard Fleming stand on making America healthy again. But before we introduce him, I just want to read our mission statement. The Wellness Crusaders mission is to educate and empower you to make informed choices for your health, the health of our children, our communities, and our earth. We are committed to fostering a world where the balance between human health and environmental stewardship is respected and nurtured. We hope you will join us on our holistic and transformative crusade as we work together to create a healthier, more harmonious world for all. And a few disclaimers. The listeners understand that the role of a health coach is not to prescribe or assess micro and macronutrient levels, to provide health care, medical, or nutritional therapy services, or to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease, condition, or other physical or mental ailments of the human body. Rather, the coach is a mentor and a guide who has been trained and certified in holistic health coaching to help clients positively achieve a greater sustainable lifestyle and to learn about how food is medicine and medicine is food. The poisons that we're going to be talking about really start in the soil. And with all the chemicals that all of these farmers are spraying, our precious soil is literally turned into dirt. And it's important for the listeners to walk away understanding not only where did these chemicals all from, but what you can do to have a greater impact on your family. It's up to us, the Wellness Crusaders, Dr. Richard Fleming, and other doctors that we interview, to educate you to take a step, to read the labels, to look at the ingredients, and to be aware of the food that you are feeding your families. So, I'm going to be bringing Dr. Fleming in, and we are well on our way. Well, hello once again, my dear friend, Dr. Richard Fleming.
How are you tonight?
How are you?
I'm doing
Oh,
well,
well,
thank you.
yeah. So I know we have a lot to talk about. Where I would like to start tonight, your book that was just released last month, Are We the Next Endangered Species? Bioweapons, Eugenics, and More. And I remember talking to you as you were writing this and how I said, I'm not interested in history. I'm going to probably bypass those chapters and get to the meat. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I picked up the book, and at chapter 2, my whole world opened up. Even though I've been fighting most of my career life against the dangers of herbicides like Roundup and other, you know, herbicides and pesticides out there, I honestly was not aware of the history of where these chemicals began and how long ago that they started. And I think the thing that intrigued me most was I never knew about Francis Galt in 1894, which is really where eugenics began. And because it began so long ago, we fast forward to 2024, and the things that were talked about, like on the debate, and the things that you are talking about, and that RFK is talking about making America healthy again, it honestly goes back to 1894 and probably before then, when all of these chemicals were not only introduced into our foods, they were introduced and injected into our bodies. And I am devastated at what I read and that we're not learning from history and that we keep repeating all the mistakes that happened way back then. And I feel that now is the time that we have to get this out. We can't sugarcoat this anymore. You walk down the grocery stores, you look at the labels, bio-engineered foods. I'm sorry, bioengineered foods stumbled a little bit. Most people don't even know what that is. And I had a nurse practitioner friend of mine that literally was in the grocery store looking at the aisles, just down reading the labels. Someone picked up a can that she had just put down and she said, "Excuse me, did you know that there are bioengineered ingredients in that?" And they looked at her, put that can in her cart, and walked away. Like, people don't know, they don't have the time to do the research that you have been doing all of your career, 50 plus decades, not to call you out on your age. I've been doing this for,
Well,
20
50
decades.
plus years, maybe not 50 plus decades.
Wow, 50 plus years. You're right. 5 decades, 50 plus years. Anyway, I just I think parents, I think people are overwhelmed that they just don't know where to go. But I got to tell you, big tech, they can't find the truth. And I'm going to put this out there just so listeners can hear me. When Mark Zuckerberg came out and did an apology on how he censored doctors like you, doctors like Dr. Pierre Corey, all sorts of other doctors who was trying to get the truth out, what was really happening in that pandemic world we were living in back in 19 or 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. Fast forward, still living in 2024 because people still don't know where to find the truth. Mark Zuckerberg, I won't accept his apology because he was instrumental on millions of deaths throughout the world by censoring doctors like you. And I'm sorry, I really try not to get involved in politics, especially on this show, but we're at the point people can't find the truth. So, with this said, welcome to Main Street Media. Um, I want to get started only because we've got a lot to talk about tonight.
Well, I think just briefly in response to what you just said, I think if Zuckerberg actually was apologetic, it would be a different matter and you would feel differently in your response. But what you're reflecting is a man who's simply coming forward to save his skin, so to speak. He's not really apologetic. He doesn't feel like he did anything wrong. He's just like the kid who got caught with their hand in the cookie jar, and now he's trying to get out of trouble and being sent to his room. So I think that's probably the best way to think about this. If these people genuinely were apologetic, if they came forward and said, "I made a mistake," or "I was under this impression versus that impression," I think we would have a different response. But we're not hearing that from any of these people. So I just wanted to interject that following what you said previously, and I'll step back and let you ask questions.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, you are right. Um, I mean, as you all know, my brother was murdered. Uh, he didn't have the shot. He couldn't get the right medicine in the hospital. But his family couldn't find the answers. And so they were listening to doctors who either were so ignorant that they didn't do the research, they couldn't spend the time doing it like you do, or they couldn't find the answers. And that's what's sad. And I'm not the only one in this world that has the tragic story of a death of a family member. But all I know is that my husband and I were blessed enough to meet you, and we now have a voice with you and 10letters.org, which we will be talking about later. So, in your newest book, and why people should read it, I have to tell you, chapter two, by far, so far, is the best book that I have read on the history of eugenics. But you explain in your book that history will be written about what we do or what we do not do.
Mm.
That was very impactful to me. And again, there's many stories all around the world, people dying of not just COVID or COVID shots, but all of this crap, all of this poison that they're putting into our food and making our families sick because the nutrition is not nutrition anymore. You've spent decades graciously giving your own time in order to give and educate the world on the knowledge about eugenics. So, welcome again, Dr. Fleming. Today, I just want to cover part one and part two. So, let's just jump in. What is inflammothrombotic disease?
So a lot of people refer to it as inflammation, and that's kind of part of the car, but it's not the entire vehicle that carries us down the road of life. When something enters your body reacts to it. Doesn't matter whether it comes in, you're breathing it, you're eating it, you're injected with it, you take a medication, it really, really does not matter. Your body is going to respond to it. And when it does, it's either going to recognize it as, okay, it should be here, or wait a minute, it probably shouldn't be here, or not to this extent. And when it says not to this extent, it has an inflammothrombotic response. Your immune system, which guards your body, doesn't matter whether it's your skin, your lungs, your blood, any other part of your body, responds to it. And different cells either make chemicals that cause tissue damage, which causes swelling, or they make chemicals that cause blood clotting that walls off an area. And so it causes an inflammothrombotic response. If that happens suddenly and then it gets corrected, you're never the wiser. Your body has done everything. But when the insult continues to pile on, your body doesn't have time to recover. So it doesn't go back into what's referred to, homeostasis, that fine balance mechanism. And as a result, then that inflammothrombotic response will become a disease because it's abnormal. And now you have an inflammothrombotic response disease. So that can be heart disease, strokes, diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, abortions. It can happen from too much fat in your diet, from too much refined processed food in your diet, from too many calories that are simply going to make that fat in your body, to homocysteine, to fibrinogen, like protein low A viruses, bacteria. A wide variety of things can do it. If everything is allowed to stay in balance, it will, but continue to add insult to injury, and it will no longer be able to recover. You would just have this long, drug out inflammothrombotic response disease.
Okay, that was a great explanation. But before I get into talking about the next question on what is pseudouridine and why
Mhm.
is it important, I just want to kind of recap what you said. So, inflammation, inflammothrombotic disease, diabetes, too much fat, high cholesterol, all these doctors not talking about what the root cause of this disease is. And you and I were talking earlier. No one's really done any studies, you said, on what happens when somebody eats a cat. So,
Yeah.
could that be possible that the illegal immigrants, some of them coming in not legally, from different countries where maybe it's more common in their country to eat a cat. Listen, I went to Japan. I'm Japanese. I didn't eat horse, even though it was on the menu.
Mhm.
I love horses. People in America love horses. I couldn't eat horse, but there's no studies, and so now we it's common in some of the states, Ohio, for example, but what are your thoughts on like eating some of these street pet animals now?
Well, let's be clear. What I saw the other night in the quote debate unquote um, really informed me that most people are too young to have any real experience or have not traveled outside the United States to have a real experience of what the rest of the world does. There are cryogenic diseases that occur around the world because people eat chilled monkey brains. My
Can you
era,
explain what cryogenic disease is, just for
sure.
maybe some of
So
our listeners that don't know what it is?
right. So a prion is an abnormally folded protein or structure that causes other proteins that come into contact with it to change its structure, and it's a domino effect. And what happens is that once the proteins change their structure, they no longer work because, it's kind of like having a vehicle, having been in a vehicle accident and it's all crushed in, the axle's been broken, everything else, it's no longer going to work as a car and it's now permanently deformed. So this is proteins changing their form. And there are people, I had a friend when he was still alive who'd been to the New Zealand area, who'd been offered the opportunity to eat chilled monkey brains. He did not. Other people did, and they suffered the consequence. I took care of one of these patients when I was a medical student. During my era, if you've lived long enough, the Vietnam War, we got to see people in Southeast Asia that ate dogs, ate cats. I will tell you, having been homeless for part of my life, which can happen to just about anybody, uh, when you're homeless, there are a lot of people that will look for whatever food source they can get. And, there's a lot of people that have eaten squirrel. And I would argue that many people don't consider eating a cat or dog much different. Sometimes the animals are actually used in sacrifice. When I was applying to join my fellowship at the University of Texas in 1989, I came down. I shared this story with you briefly before, and the patrol cars went flying by the hotel room where I was staying at, and two doors down, they went to arrest the father of a gang member, of a cult gang member that was from Matamoros, just south of Texas, because his son was involved in witchcraft, voodoo, and cult processing, where they didn't find any human bodies, although we were told that at times there was human blood that they found. But they sacrificed animals, including dogs and cats and chickens and a wide variety of things. So when I hear people laugh at something, like it was mentioned the other night in the debate, my first response is that they either haven't lived very long or they've not been exposed to a lot of the world that exists. Because to believe that people, the life that we live in the United States, or that people live in Western Europe or even in Russia, is the way everybody on the planet lives is a mistake. There are different people that have different cultures, that eat different animals, and they practice different religious cults. And I'm not saying that's what they're doing, but I have seen firsthand some of this. And so, sadly enough, if people are laughing at that, it means they didn't step back and go, well, okay, that is a possibility. I don't know whether it's true. And that should have been the response. I don't know if it's true, but what if? And I can tell you that while there hasn't been a study done of people just eating dog or just eating cat to see what it does to heart disease, I can tell you there has been work done, research, and it's been published looking at that same NER5 AC receptor in dogs and cats and horses and other animals. So dogs and cats have been studied in this specifically. And it is, as we've talked about before, antigenic. It will cause this inflammothrombotic response disease process. And we know it's more true of organ meat than skeletal or muscle. But all of these animals, including dogs and cats, have been researched enough to know they have this NER5 AC receptor, which makes them different enough from humans that if we consume them, you will have heart disease and strokes and the rest.
Even including parasites. So there's a creek over here by where I live, and the obviously the fish are swimming in it, but people come here to fish. problem is that you've got all the farm animals, the
Mhm.
cows and the horses, the pigs and the goats, and they're all pooping in this water, so all the feces is in the water. And Giardia is very prevalent
Right.
in Deer Creek Reservoir by me. It's also prevalent in the Jordanelle. And I know several people who have fished, who have swam, who have ended up with Giardia. And it's just that bacteria. So I can only imagine what dogs and cats have, let alone horses. So would you say that when Trump made that comment on the debate, that I've looked at the videos, I've watched these people um, talking about what they are seeing in their towns, police maybe not taking it, factual or not doing anything about it. But I believe that Trump was right by saying that based on everything that is going around and whether Kamala Biden's team is actually listening to the people or not, doubtfully. Um, she was wrong.
Well, I think there's 2 points here. First off, let's remember who his vice presidential running mate is, J.D. Vance, who is from Ohio.
Ohio.
So he's talking about this is part. My understanding is because Trump referred to that, and Vance, you could see that he responded to this. Vance is talking about a state that he is from, that he has firsthand knowledge about. The second thing is that there are also reports, credible reports, out of Ohio, that some of the Haitian refugees that are there are being taken advantage of. They're being charged exorbitant amounts of money to just rent a cot inside a house, and they're finding themselves somewhat taken advantage of by unscrupulous people that are there. So the poor city is confronted with people that are dealing with the consequences of going from roughly 60,000 to 80,000 people, right? That's a substantial change in a few years. And other people then abusing the Haitians because they don't know what the rules are here. So they're coming in not knowing the rules. They're coming in with certain predispositions for how to survive. And most people will do what they need to do to survive. And some of them are being taken advantage of by people, which puts them in a more desperate scenario for trying to figure out how they're going to live, how they're going to eat, and thinking about it from a logistics perspective, if they were living in Haiti and they are now living in Ohio, they are probably thinking we have no way to leave here. This is where we are. We must survive. So I think that this response to what Trump said was a somewhat narrow, uneducated response. And, I did watch, I'm also an attorney, and I will tell you that if you do not have a winning case, one of the best things to do when you start talking to the jury, the people in watching you, is to say everything you're going to hear from the other side is a lie. Where if you have a winning case, you simply wait for them to present a lie and then you point out why it's a lie. And I think people would do well to understand this perspective. Um, as an attorney, this is a trick from the playbook of I don't have a case, so let me do what I can to bias the jury before we even get into a discussion. All right.
Right. Right. Okay. So I'm going to say Trump was right because there are stories out there. That's my
So
opinion.
the reality is it independent of anything else, a it is not a mature, educated response to laugh at something like that. That demonstrates the behavior of what I would expect elementary school students to have when they giggle when somebody talks about sex.
And I don't think that was a comment that the moderator needed to say after President Trump, because I'm
The
sure
the
she's living in her bubble with her organic food and her clean source water that other people don't have the opportunity to do, including these illegal immigrants. The ones that are here
the
legally, who came in the right way, God bless them. The ones who just snuck in through the borders, I'm sorry, I'm going to say, and even on my show, they need to go back to where they came from.
well, and very importantly, the function of a moderator is not to become a debater. The function of a moderator is to keep the debaters on task. And I say that recognizing that in the school system that I was raised in, not even on my PhD component, but on the secondary school system component, I was in debate class in 7th grade. I was on debate class. I was on radio broadcasting classes because that was an elective that was possible. And in debate class, you learn the difference between debaters and moderators. Moderators do not exchange in the debate. And when they do, they have become part of the debate and they have invalidated their function as moderators. And they both did that.
Agreed. Next question. What is pseudouridine and why is it important?
All right.
Important
So,
to know.
right. So everything is made up of building blocks independent upon what we're talking about. When we're talking about mRNA, the building blocks of mRNA are called nucleosides. There are 4 of them, and one of them is known as uridine. When research was being done in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and they were trying to do gene therapy with mRNA, they couldn't do it. When they were trying to do vaccine therapy with it, they couldn't do it because outside of a cell, mRNA or DNA is a prion. It is a protein that breaks down, changes structure, and then makes other proteins abnormal. So it will not do its function. So Carrico and Weissman were 2 of the researchers working on this. And in 2008, they published their paper, which to a researcher like me means they were doing the research probably between 2005 and 2007, because 1 year turnaround is pretty quick for most research papers. Last year, 2023, they got the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this work. So it is important, well-recognized work. It's not something that was done off to the side that nobody's read about. So in 2008, they published a paper and they said, we were able to stabilize mRNA. And how they did it is they took that one component, that one nucleoside known as uridine, they flipped a couple atoms around and made it a false uridine. Now in science, that's known as pseudo-uridine. Pseudo means false. So they took and they flipped a couple atoms around. It changed the uridine molecule. It made it pseudouridine. When they made mRNA with pseudouridine, lo and behold, it didn't break apart. It didn't malfold. It stayed, its structure maintained its integrity, and it could do its job. But good researchers don't just do simple projects. They ask the next question, and so did Carrico and Weissman. And they said, okay, we're making mRNA with pseudouridine. We've stabilized it. Now can it be used? Well, what would you use it for? 2 things. 1, a genetic vaccine. So they tried it. They injected it. And then they measured the chemicals that are released with an inflammatory thrombotic response. They measured interferon. They measured tissue necrosis factor alpha. They measured interleukin 2. They measured antibodies. Very blunted effect. They compared it with regular uridine mRNA. That made an effect. Couldn't use it because you didn't have a way to get it in the cell. And they weren't doing the lipid nanoparticle work in 2008. Or at least they were just beginning. It was early on, so they hadn't covered that burden yet. So they said, we stabilized it, and it does not work as a vaccine. But guess what? They also said, we looked at it, it would make a great transfection tool. So it would make a great tool that could be, or transduction tool, a great tool to alter DNA in cells if we used it, right? And I said that backwards. It's a great transfection tool, which means non-viral when they put it in. So we stabilize the molecule. It won't work as a vaccine. 2008. It will not work as a vaccine, but it will work as gene therapy. Why is that important? Because pseudouridine is what's used in these eugenic genetic vaccines. It's only useful for a genetic tool. It is not useful as a vaccine, and yet that's what's in the eugenic genetic vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna. Janssen's a little bit different because that's DNA, and they modified some of that. And then they learned how to stick it inside a lipid nanoparticle, which is basically the outside of a cell, which doesn't break down, but it does go into your cells. It merges with your cells. And early on in the 2015 to 2017 era, Moderna did a research project with lipid nanoparticle influenza eugenic genetic vaccines. And the study was that they followed up with said, of course, it does what normally happens in the human body, which is it went to the brain, the liver, the spleen, the heart, the testes, the ovaries. It goes throughout the body. It would be in the same way that it is ignorant to laugh at somebody talking about someone eating dogs or cats when people around the world do, as if, well, now they're in the United States, they wouldn't. You know, something happens when you cross that border. I don't know what it is, but apparently there's something that happens magically. In that same way, this perception was these lipid nanoparticles were not spread around. Well, the science says exactly the opposite. And to believe that they don't and that they stay localized, or to believe any of the other misinformation is ignorant.
Okay, thank you for that. So, what is the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty that you wrote about? Chapter 2.
So, you know, from the earlier than that, when this country in 1700s, the British were using smallpox, and biological weapons date back thousands of years. By the time World War I was happening and World War II was happening, and biological and chemical weapons were being unleashed upon military and civilian populations. At the conclusion of Vietnam for the United States in 1974, roughly, in 1975, the world governments kind of got together essentially and said, "Listen, we're not going to develop biological weapons anymore. We're not going to develop them. We're going to destroy them. You know, we're going to share our technology, so there's no fear." So in 1975, the United States, the Ukraine, Russia, a variety of other countries, all on the same date, signed the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty that said we will not make these weapons. They're too dangerous, and we won't experiment with them. And you know, the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act followed that, which was a law passed by Congress that re-solidified that. 18 U.S.C. Section 175 was later passed to go further and say we won't even take things out of nature and take them to a lab and alter them because it's just wrong. Now, all of that taken into account in the 1990s, when Russia pulled back from its Eastern Bloc, the United States Department of Defense went in and took over those labs that the Russians had. And we went into Ukraine and we released this to the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty Conference, because by agreement, every 10 or so years, we have to issue reports. So during the pandemic, the U.S. submitted its report to the Biological Weapon Convention Treaty authorities, telling them in the 1990s, we went into Ukraine and other countries and secured the biological weapons that Russia wasn't supposed to be building, but they were, just like we were, even though we signed an agreement that we wouldn't. And by the way, the treaties are federal law because under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, it states treaties are the supreme law of the land. So once a treaty is signed by the president and ratified by Congress, with whatever restrictions Congress places on it, which they do by reservations and understandings, once that's in effect, that's federal law. That's supreme law. It's above federal law. It's constitutional law. And this is how it lays out. Constitutional law is it. It takes priority over everything. It's priority over federal law, which can have preemption over state laws. But constitutional law is it. These people, the Department of Defense, USAID, NIH, NIAID, all the agencies that I've talked about in the books that funded these biological weapons have broken constitutional law, period. And the International Covenant on Civil, the International Criminal Court has received documents from Slovakia, the only country that has refused to sign on to the international health rules and regulations of the World Health Organization that's a part of the UN. With my encouragement and documents that I provided and Mr. Charles Rixey provided. And now Slovakia has submitted to the International Criminal Court a requirement. They are calling for the ICC to put together an investigatory committee. They have laid out the criteria for experts and they have submitted, it doesn't mean it will happen, but they have submitted my name to be on that council if the ICC will form it under Slovakia's call for it, which means that committee would then review who the criminals in the world are responsible for these biological weapons and call for action.
I think one of the things I don't understand is, the United States is supposed to be one of the most powerful countries, but there's other countries that are leading the way on what is happening. So let me ask you this other question, because you're talking about the biological weapons, eugenics. You wrote about Francis Galton and how he said, give the more suitable races of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable. And in 1883, is this where eugenics started?
No, the eugenics started, we know that the Greeks practiced eugenics. I mean, roughly 1/4 of the Greek children were killed by their parents. They were tossed down wells. The bones of those children were found in the wells. The kind of a reverse scenario here, when you think about it, in those wells were dogs, wild dogs, that were put down there that would eat the children. We know that because the bones of the children are found in the remains of the dogs. And this is how they got rid of their imperfect children. So when everybody says the United States is a democracy, it's not, it's a republic. And everybody says we should be like Greece, ancient Greece. Well, I guess we are. We have embraced the eugenics phenomenon that plagued Greece during its era because it saw all these imperfections as undesirable. But many of these imperfections are what keep humanity alive. Because if there's too much imperfection, the baby will die inside mom, in utero. That's why many of the spontaneous abortions already occur, because it's not viable. The baby can't survive. But many of the unusual genetics that we talk about, like sickle cell anemia, there's a survival advantage there because sickle cell patients, unlike you or I'm presuming you're not sickle cell, and I'm certainly not, we would suffer greatly and possibly die if we get infected with malaria. Sickle cell patients will not die. They're never going to become an Olympic athlete. There's a trade-off. But that genetic, that one single nucleoside based change produced survivability for humans in an area of malaria, where if my ancestors or your ancestors would have gone there, we'd have been dead from malaria. So when we look at these variabilities, which I think is important to bring up in light of a couple things going on right now, in a society where everybody is talking about inclusivity and accepting variability of different people, this eugenics continuation is actually the exact opposite of it. So the argument that I make in the book, and you'll get to it as I go through there, this inclusivity only works if you agree with us. But if you don't agree with us, well, you're not a part of that inclusivity. And the decision on eugenics right now is, what do they want to work on eliminating? Because eugenics is not the let's go kill somebody, which is what most people think of with Adolf Hitler and concentration camps. Let's go kill people, right? That's not eugenics, although that will get eugenics done because it keeps the genes from moving forward. Eugenics is a decision about what you're going to allow to move forward, what you're going to hold back, and what you're going to allow to thrive. And to kind of wrap this up with Adolf Hitler, it's kind of interesting that the hydrogen cyanide capsules that Hitler used to kill off people in the gas chambers, that came from the United States. We used this in the 1800s in California for a fumicide to around citrus plants. That's where hydrogen cyanide, these capsules, were first used as a toxic cyanide substance to kill the insects in the citrus groves of California.
Okay, that was a lot to take in. It was good.
Sorry.
It was a lot to take
Yeah.
in. So simplify this then for me. So eugenics, which allows what will be allowed to carry forward.
Mm-hmm.
What is CRISPR simply, and how does it play a role in eugenics?
Here's that word simply. So CRISPR is, we have our immune system, humans do. CRISPR was our discovery of the immune system that bacteria have. What bacteria do is they look at a virus infecting it, they cut its either its DNA or its RNA, depending upon what type of virus it is, and insert it into the DNA of the bacteria so that when they get reinfected by that virus, the bacteria says, wait a minute, I've seen this genetic sequence before. It's that virus. I'm going to protect against it. So CRISPR is the ability, so it's the immune system of bacteria, but what it taught humans was how to cut DNA, because that's what the CRISPR technology of the bacteria did. It cut viral DNA. So we used it to learn how to cut in very specific places genetic sequences. Now we couple that to make the genetic sequences that we want to survive and put it into eugenic genetic vaccines to be taken up by human cells. 18% of our DNA is composed of what's known as long interspersed nuclear elements 1, which is human method of taking outside genetic code and putting it in our DNA. So our line 1 equals bacteria's CRISPR technique. Okay? Except that the bacteria use it only for its immunology, and we use it for everything. It's much more sophisticated. We're more sophisticated animals than bacteria. So it's the same thing. And we've used the knowledge of learning how the bacteria protect itself to learn how to cut genetic codes, to splice where we want to splice, to make segments of what we want to be inserted and cut in humans.
So basically, CRISPR being used on someone only wanting a male child could cut the female gene out?
So the difference between male and female isn't necessarily a set of genes, although technically technically it is. The Y chromosome has a gene sequence known as SRY, and that's sex regulatory hormone that normally appears. So SR, sex regulatory, that's usually on the Y chromosome. So SRY is the part of our genetic sequence that makes us male. So you lack that. I don't.
Well, thank you.
But there
And
are
I will
some,
I definitely say I lack that.
but there are some males. there are, I, so this depends upon. This is the tricky part of it. There are some instances where a Y chromosome doesn't exist, but the SRY gene is sitting on the X chromosome. These are the true cases of what do you have, right? I mean, this is the only time there is a confusion, because if the SRY gene sequence is what makes you male, it doesn't matter that it's on the X chromosome in somebody, it will make them male. But there won't be any ambiguity about it. They won't be confused. They will have male sex organs, they will have male sex development. It's just if you check their chromosomes, you'll see XX. And that may not make sense to people, but that's SRY almost always is on the Y chromosome. That's why it's got that Y at the end of it. But occasionally it has occurred in X chromosomes. But there are other cases like XXO and XXY and XO where there's ambiguity in the sex, and Klinefelter's Turner syndrome being two of the ones I just mentioned. There are some unusual cases, but I will guarantee you it has not produced a sudden surge in human population, because when these confusion states occur, they don't produce a reproducible, viable individual. And so genetically, it is terminated by virtue of having a defect that is not consistent with human viability.
Okay. All right. That was good. It made sense. So then, after you talk about, um, sorry, Galton, sorry, you then go on to talk about the British Eugenics Education Society that was founded in 1907, where they targeted the feeble minded. Is that because they considered the feeble minded weak and they wanted them out of existence?
Yeah, both the United States and England were trying to perfect its species, so to speak, and anybody that was undesirable, they either had a physical abnormality, they were a criminal. Trump would love this. They were a criminal. I should like it too, right? Feeble-minded. We're not going to be the betterment of society. They wanted those people eliminated in in the UK, in the United States. I mean, Churchill was a big proponent of this, right?
Oh, we're going to ask about that next.
I mean, this is so when you look back at the history of the people, many of the people that we'd like to think of fondly, they're not so fond when you get into some of the belief systems they had and some of the things that they were in favor of, you know. And maybe there's a lesson there for everybody, that when you're looking at somebody and you don't like them, you might want to ask yourself whether there's other thing, whether your problem is that you just don't like them personally and their personal views, but maybe you like what they would do for society in general. You need to ask yourself those questions, because as I did for a town hall meeting, when I was asked to hold one of these by Mr. Podesta before Obama was first inaugurated. I asked people the question: how many of you would like somebody who was considered himself very religious, always tithed to his church, was faithful to his significant other, didn't really drink. Oh, yeah, yeah, we like that. Yeah, well, congratulations. You, based upon that bias, you just elected Adolf Hitler. Now, maybe we have to be a little bit better in or different, at least open to thinking about what our selection criteria are, because some of the methods that we use to select out have gotten us really bad results, right? And yet, I would argue that people should be allowed to express themselves, even when I disagree with them. I firmly believe if Adolf Hitler were here today, I would let him express himself, because I think to people that would listen to what I have to say, I could lay out the argument that you should think maybe this is not the guy to follow. Now, there's going to be some people that aren't going to follow my argument, and they would follow Adolf Hitler. And clearly, in the 1930s, people followed him. He told them what they wanted. He told them they had been abused. He told them they could get back their glory. He told them they were the superior people. And I'm sure they were all singing. They were very joyous. They sounded very joyous. I shouldn't have done that for you. But as a campaign motto, he was very. They were all very happy, weren't they? I'll let you just go to your next question, Maria.
All right. So Winston Churchill, I was really surprised about this when I read about it. So, do you think he was successful in forcing sterilization?
So I know that they worked on it. Um, there's a lot of things about England that I have better data on the U.S. than I do on England, for just simply because of my background, training, and my contacts. Um, I have contacts with MI6, but I don't have the types of contacts that would give me better detailed information there. We know that Adolf Hitler. Uh, Adolf Hitler had concentration camps on English soil. I don't know if you know that or not, but
I
the
did
the
not.
the Channel Isles, the British pulled back and left the British people to be conquered by the Nazis, where they had concentration camps. And they're only now finding out that instead of about 100 dead, there were probably about 100 to 200,000 that were killed in those concentration camps, just on the Channel Islands between France and England, which are British sovereign ground. So and I use that as an example because there's a lot of things that we're just undigging um, about what the British were doing, even though we know that post World War II, as I mentioned before, between England, France, the UK, Canada, the United States, and Russia, we brought more than 3,000 Nazis out and installed them in our military, our intelligence agencies, our medical communities. So we know England did that. We know that that's right in fitting with that eugenics program. We know that in this country, they were continuing with eugenics and missile programs, and other programs on electronics. So where I don't have hard and fast numbers for you, I mean, there were several 100,000. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers. Women sterilized in the United States following the Supreme Court decision with Buck v. Bell and all the state laws that happened here. I would not be surprised for somebody to eventually dig up, if they haven't destroyed the records, which would have been the smart thing for them to do, torch it. Then you can't uncover. Really bad people tend to keep really good records, is what I find. Really good intelligence agencies keep no records, because the way you prevent somebody from knowing what you're doing is to not make records. and other people that are really bad love to make records because they think history is going to reward them and they're going to be seen as the heroes. And Nazi Germany did a lot of that, and the United States has done a lot of that. I mean, a lot of my ability to dig up records are because they think those records are buried, and they are pretty well hidden, but you can get to them if you know how to do it.
Well, I will tell you, hell probably plays a role in a lot of their lives. But let's talk about Margaret Sanger. She died in 1966 and also probably as a hot place in hell. She opened the first birth control clinic in the United States. She played a role in eugenics. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Uh, yeah, I mean, as pointed out in the book, I mean, this was a woman who really did believe that people of color were undesirable. Her goal was to play into that and to use those funds to, basically the approach has been a woman should have a right to decide what to do with her body. And
Kind of like Kamala the other night.
well, the irony here, yes, no, I remember. The irony here is that, I used to be a police officer, and one of the things on the front podium was a saying that said, "Your right to swing your fist stops where the other person's face begins." Right. So once you interact with another human being, now you don't have certain rights. You have the right to do everything up to that point. But once you interact with another human being and it has a consequence, now it's not just you. So unless, you know, and I've dealt with both sides of this argument over the years as I've addressed, and I've been involved as a medical student, just for transparency. As a medical student, I went to abortions and witnessed what they were. We were given the option. I felt I needed to go. I needed to see what it was. I think, seeing what something is different than just reading in a textbook, and to see what really happens is not something that I'll, like everything else I've done in my life, is not something I'm ever going to get out of my brain. And it's okay. I accept the things pro and con that have happened and those experiences. I know what they look like. I know what it really is. But, you know, Planned Parenthood was, we're going to control the undesirables and we're going to eliminate those traits. And you can then later on sell it in a new package, in a new wrap. It's like regifting, I suppose, right? You get something you don't want and you put it in a new package and see if you can sell it. I mean, Nixon was using federal funds. I don't know where that's in the book. I don't know if that's in chapter 2, where he was doing of housing funds to try to deal with sterilization of people of color. And that was their way of helping. And the argument's been, so listen, you should have a right to take and do what you want with your body, unless of course it's a vaccine mandate, and then all bets are off on that. But good, you got the sarcasm in that.
Yes, I did.
The reality is, they wanted to control who did and didn't have children. And the Supreme Court went along with that. We did forced sterilization in the United States. So it doesn't matter how your approach is. All of these, both bioweapons and eugenics and all the rest of this, they just transition, they change. We don't like to talk about eugenics because, well, that's what the Nazis did. And even though they got it from us, we started it, they worked on it, and then we brought them over to continue it. We don't want to talk about that because let's sell it as something different. Now they're vaccines. We're going to decide to tell women of color that we want them to have all the economic advantages of everybody else. And it would be unfair if they were too young or too unready to have a child. We will give them a way out and tell them it's about them having a choice. Well, that choice stopped when the other person's face entered, or in this case, penis, I suppose, because unless people are doing it by some mechanism other than what I've been trained in, both scientific and medically, it's called intercourse, and that's how you have conceived children. And if you don't want to do that, there are some really good ways to avoid that. But if you want to be able to do whatever you want to do, maybe eat cupcakes and not have the consequences of it, um, then you have to deal with it. And I guess, try to take in Ipecac and vomit back up the cupcake. But this is a method of abusing women. When you tell someone that you are their friend and you are doing this for them, and it's not about them, it's really about you and your agenda. When you tell women that this is about women having control over their bodies, this is like telling a child, go drive the car. That they're not mature enough to apparently go do it, and there's a consequence to it if you have a problem, right?
Right.
There's a consequence, and it's called conception. Um, and I will argue that I am, and people won't like this, but I'm going to say it anyway because you know me, I'm not about whether people like what I have to say. I'm about trying to tell you the truth. If you have been raped, if there is incest, or your life is on the line, I'm pro-abortion. I do not think you should have to suffer with a criminal act being carried out upon you.
Agreed.
And I don't think the child should have to deal with the consequences of coming out in that scenario. And I have news for Ms. Harris. Okay. If you're in the back seat of a vehicle bleeding and hemorrhaging, there is no physician who is going to deny you medical care. Don't give me that number. I don't want to hear it. I don't want anybody else to be led astray on that. That was the most ridiculous example she could have come up with. No physician has ever denied treatment that I'm aware of. And if you've got one, boys and girls, let me know. Treatment to a bleeding patient, period.
Just another one of those lies.
We have a lot of people that have done a lot of bad things in medicine in the last 4.5 years, but that's not one of them.
So you go on, and Indiana, that's originally where I was from, they passed the first compulsory sterilization law in the world in 1907, followed by Wisconsin, which was in support of forced sterilization in 1913. And then SCOTUS upheld sterilization laws in 1927.
Yeah, so in 1927, Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's typically known as a good justice, the case of Buck v. Bell was, his conclusion was three generations of imbeciles are enough. So yes, we had forced sterilization in the United States, which led to, in the end, the number was roughly 70,000 forced sterilizations in the United States. They literally forced. It means it wasn't up to the person. They did not have a decision. The courts intervened, the legal system intervened and said, you're going to be sterilized. This was the law of the land. So when people are upset about Roe v. Wade being overturned, this decision by Oliver Wendell Holmes has never been overturned. Now they've tried to get everybody to ignore the fact that they said that by trying to get rid of these laws. But this is an example of mistakes having been made by the Supreme Court justices, in my opinion. They thought they were completely right. There were 9 justices. Only one justice did not agree with this, and that was the Catholic.
Right.
That was the Catholic. And one of the things that, and I don't play this very often for people because it's not important scientifically that people understand it. But, one of the things that justice and John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and then Robert Kennedy Jr. and I all have in common is we're Catholic. And, you know, we are one of the favorite attack groups for different groups of people. I won't say who. Between Jews and Catholics, we have a pretty good vested hold on a group of individuals with a religion that other people like to attack. And yet it was only that justice that said this is a wrong decision. And Holmes was pro-abortion. He was clear on that in his records.
That's interesting. So you talked about the execution and mental institutions by giving them infected milk, which there was up to a 40% mortality rate. I mean, we right now have food that is being pumped full of chemicals.
Hmm.
Similar. They're not being forced because most people don't know. But execution by infected milk, that's pretty sick.
Well, the United States government has a long track record of experimenting on its people. You know, the infected milk, the Tuskegee Airmen. I actually knew one of the Tuskegee Airmen, you know, giving people syphilis and then allowing them to go into, eventually you have primary, then secondary, and then tertiary syphilis, which is where the spirochete of syphilis has gone into your brain, and you're dead at that point. You will die. Um, our government has done some fairly masochistic experiments on U.S. citizens because they think they're right to do it, right? I mean, no bad guy in the history of the universe that I know of ever said or thought they were the bad guy. They always thought they were the good guy. If you had asked Adolf Hitler, he was convinced he was doing the right thing. If you'd asked the people who did these poisonous milk experiments, they were convinced they did the right thing. If you ask the people who did Tuskegee, they were convinced they did the right thing. If you ask the people that paid for the biological weapon SARS-CoV-2, they would tell you they were doing the right thing because they know what's right.
So you talk about Hitler. Over 400,000 sterilized is really what he's known for. It's almost a 500,000 people
Mm-hmm.
unwillingly. Yet we,
That's almost half the city of Dallas, Texas.
and then tell me a little bit about, and hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, Acteon T4, which killed
Action
in
T4.
300
Right.
another 300,000. So now we're, almost at 1 million people roughly.
Right.
What
So
what is Acteon T4?
well, Acteon was the street address. That's where it got its name.
Oh,
That is the German street address for these experiments, and these were the early on experiments where they were. It was pre gas chamber, where they were trying to make decisions about who was and who wasn't going to live amongst the German people. You know, the undesirables, in the same way that we were doing it in the United States with, are we going to allow the imbeciles to live or the people with disease? So Acteon was, again, the street address for the project, designed to get people to bring their kids in and say, okay, we'll take care of them, but basically we're going to get rid of them because they're weak genes in the German population.
okay. All right. That clarified that. Still, again, over 300,000 people. And fast forward to 2024, it's still continuing. So,
You know, when you sell yourself the argument that there's something wrong with the people you're getting rid of and you're doing it for the betterment of the species or your country or your race or whatever, there is no line that you will not cross.
well, just because people are in psych wards doesn't mean they could be experimented on. And we'll talk about that in a little bit with what Fauci was doing.
But see, that's Laurie Gagan's perspective. It was not the perspective of those people. And that is where, you know, again, when you have a very powerful group of people, including a very powerful government, and they do not have any accountability, and we don't hold them accountable, we have given them carte blanche to do whatever they think is right, not what we think is right, not what as a society we would say this is a wrong thing to do, but what they think is the right thing to do. Go ahead.
Power hungry. Hey, Leighton, can you put the call-in number up, please? Um, Dr. Fleming, I still have some questions, but we want to put the call-in number up just in case anybody wants to be able to call in and talk to Dr. Fleming. The number to call in is 385 899 2134. Again, the phone number is 385 899 2134. We're going to leave that number up on the screen as we continue our discussions of what's happening around the world. So, a word has come up, and it's starting to pop up more and more. And it actually, I believe, goes back to Hitler, deuterium. And so people are starting to chat now about this in 2024. So, what is deuterium? I know that they use it in hydrogen bomb, but what is it? Because it's popping up in TikTok videos and Instagram posts, and I have
I'm a,
nurses and doctors talking about it in the water.
so obviously I'm not on social media enough. Um, so, you know, if you think back, hopefully at some point in your life you had a class where you saw that chart of the elements on the wall: hydrogen, helium, lithium, all of those. Everything that we have, every atomic element, has more than one type. And hydrogen has a more radioactive form of itself known as deuterium, and a more radioactive form known as tritium, where it can break down and release radiation to eventually get down to that more stable one hydrogen versus deuterium 2. So that was when you make, there's something known as heavy water. So water is H2O, or chemically known as dihydrogen oxide, 2 hydrogen 1 oxide. But if the hydrogen is made out of, instead of H1, regular hydrogen, is made up of the H2, the deuterium, you then have what's known as heavy water. Well, a certain amount of the hydrogen out there is deuterium, a certain amount is tritium. And so during World War II, I'm just trying to figure out in my mind why this is on social media. During World War II, while the United States was trying to make an atomic bomb with uranium, Germany was working on making a hydrogen bomb with heavy water, deuterium, which is much more powerful than the bomb that we made. And he was getting his resources from Norway. So the Norwegians were providing both deuterium, heavy water, for a hydrogen bomb, and steel for Hitler. And it was thanks to the Norwegians that we knew, that the United States and England knew about the atomic program of Hitler, the hydrogen bomb, because the Norwegians got word out to England and the United States that Hitler was building a hydrogen bomb with deuterium, and the Norwegians were building the heavy water for him and the steel. Norway slowed that process down by just slowly but surely decreasing the amount of deuterium and the amount of steel they provided to Hitler, and it slowed his war efforts. So as an example, we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki our second and third atomic bombs. We dropped the first one in the United States to test it. When we eventually built a hydrogen bomb, we went to the Bikini Atolls, where bikinis were first recognized, right? That's what the natives wore. That's why they are called bikinis, because they were in the Bikini Atolls. When the US dropped their hydrogen bomb and the Navy was out there looking for it, the first response was, well, you missed, there's no debris. And then they looked closer. There was no debris because there was no island left. So what they thought would put a big hole in the islands just decimated the islands. And that was a hydrogen bomb made from deuterium, heavy water. So a hydrogen bomb is so much more powerful than a uranium atomic bomb by comparison that it almost makes uranium look like a joke. But sadly, not a good joke. Did that answer that? I don't hear you.
Hold on one sec, Fleming. We're having a quick technical difficulty, so hold on.
Okay.
Got it. Sorry.
That's all right.
Accidentally opened up a second screen and lost the first screen. So thank you. Thank you for the explanation. So a follow-up question. Should we be concerned about finding that in our water right now? Could it?
Deuterium?
Yes.
No. Because deuterium's always been in our water. And we're
What
not
about
making
more?
we don't make more radioactive compounds. To do that, you have to do what's known as you could do either fusion or fission to make them, but we're not. The way that the Norwegians got this for Hitler and the way that we've made deuterium heavy water bombs is we have to take all the water and we have to go find and filter out the deuterium. We're not making more of it. We just collect what's there. So all the water you've ever drank in your life, believe it or not, has less deuterium and less tritium in it than it did when you were younger. Because the radioactive decay, there's less and less and less of it. We're not making deuterium and dumping it into our water. We have enough garbage to put in it.
I just did a heavy metal report. Yep.
We've got all sorts of garbage, and I think I probably told you, or I have on some other interviews, that part of the research I did in my life was with Tetrahymena which is another protozoan like Giardia.
What was that again? Sorry.
Tetrahymena. It's a protozoan, and the work I did, when was this? Mid to late 1970s, was taking breakdown products of shale oil and processing those, and then seeing if I could grow Tetrahymena piriformis in it, and what it would take to allow the oil industry to dump the residue into the river and you not be aware of it, so that it wouldn't affect the growth of anything like Tetrahymena. And so to do that, I added acid or base, or just kept them neutral to see what would change it chemically so it could be dumped into your water and you wouldn't be any smarter. How about that? That was that. That was a great project that I was asked to do research in the mid to late 1970s.
Well, I've been surprised. So we've been testing water for glyphosate in Utah and Florida, and the results that we're finding are pretty staggering. So, what is MK Ultra, and why was it used? I mean, it was used in like on our soldiers.
Yes, so mind control ultra, or the ultra mind control, is what where that gets its name from. So after during World War II, the hub of psychology in the United States sat between Harvard University and the University of Iowa, and this is where you say I know because Fleming's from Iowa. And I was involved in experimental psychology. That was my graduate degree. So um, and the rat lab I ran was one of the top 4 rat labs in the world. And Harrington was from Harvard. So he was from Harvard. He was in Iowa. I was his graduate student. I was also head of that research lab. So in those days, in the 1940s, they were trying to figure out what would make a good spy, what it would take to get people to talk. And I won't bore your listeners with that, although it would be a program in and of itself. But that evolved out of there to try to figure out what the OSS was going to do to become the CIA, and how we were going to become superior, how they were going to advance what the Nazis were doing. And so that started with Project 63, which evolved to Project Paperclip, which evolved to MK Ultra. The Russians were doing Operation Osavarasham and a variety of theirs. After MK Ultra, my group came along, in the 1960s. So, MK Ultra was the perspective of what could they do? Was there a way to enhance people's mental or psychic abilities? Was the application of this? Could it be used to make the perfect spy that we knew from the 1940 research between Harvard and Iowa of what it took to make a perfect spy? Could you build upon that? Could you then take people that maybe didn't crack, and could you enhance them? And psychedelics, if you psychedelics, what they tend to do is they tend to cross neuron pathways in the brain. So you see music, so you don't hear music, you see music. That's what a psychedelic does. It crosses the sensory pathways. And the perception was that, particularly given that lysergic acid diethylmide, or LSD, was one of these major hallucinogenics, is that they tried to use it on people and see if they could manipulate them to have enhanced either psychic or mental abilities. And if they couldn't do that, could they do something with what was taken from Iowa and Harvard, to break down other people, to turn them into weapons? Could you implant thoughts into somebody to get them to, at the drop of a word or a clue, turn into this roboticon to kill, right? Get them back into Russia. The Russians were doing it. We were doing it. Other nations are doing it, but not nearly as well. And there were limitations with each one of these projects. By the time they got to my group, the recognition was you couldn't take something that wasn't there and build it. You had to go find the people who had that, and then allow them to do what they would naturally do. Just provide the resources, and they would do it on their own. You couldn't manipulate better than people who had that ability, but it took a while to get to that phase. But every phase was an attempt to see what they could learn to improve upon things. I mean, before MK Ultra, the Nazis were doing it with amphetamines, right? I mean, they were doing it with their fighter pilots, and that's why the fighter pilots of Nazi Germany were superior to every other country until the Battle of Britain. And what happened is that as you use these drugs, there's a tolerance that builds up in the brain and it dumps more neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers of the brain. And by the time the Nazi pilots got to the Battle of Britain, they had peaked their effect and they had crossed over to where the deterioration in their abilities began to occur. And so they took their peak fighter pilots and basically turned them into less trained because they had pushed them so far that they hit their plateau, and then they started down that plateau, and the British were knocking them out of the sky. And it wasn't because the Brits were better. They weren't. It wasn't because the British planes were better. They weren't. It's that the Nazis had just peaked and pushed their pilots so far that they broke them. And their discovery was during the Battle of Britain.
Well, that happened too, wasn't it, in World War II? I mean, there's some other wars that I don't know if it was heroin, but there was another drug that some of the soldiers were given so that they could fight the battle with longer hours as well.
Yeah, cocaine
Sadly.
was one. Cocaine was one of the major ones that was employed for that. And you can really push people to a limit, but when it breaks, it breaks. And that was, going through MK Ultra, going through all those programs, they were pushing more and more and more, and then they finally figured out that if you're going to do this, you really had to take people very early on. You had to find out who they were, and then you had to put them in these programs, and you had to convince them that you were just interested in them and give them everything that they wanted and back them up. What they forgot was that, and test them to make sure that they will do what you want, which is that run them through scenarios every week, see if they're willing to kill people, and reward them if they are. And if they don't, they get dropped out. The problem is when you select that group of people, you're going to find some unethical ones that are probably going to stay with you and do whatever, but you're also going to find people that I consider ethical that will say, yeah, okay, now I know what you're doing. And the reality is that the people that are being trained that way are actually the smarter people, not the ones that think that they have them in a Skinner box, right?
Okay.
Which is a behavior modification box for people who don't know what Skinner is. But Skinner, when you talk to Skinner, and he didn't have, if you talked outside of Skinnerian behavioral modification, he didn't have a clue what you were talking about. He was completely confused. It's like you were talking to him in Latin.
Wow.
Go ahead.
I'll just sickness. So as we start to wind down, I want your thoughts on a couple things. CIA, trust them or no?
To do what?
I don't know, just in general. I mean, I've read, you talk about it, in chapter 2 on how
Yeah.
they were involved in a lot, but because of time constraints, just your opinion on my opinion's no.
So
But
I think the CIA is an incredibly dangerous organization. It's kind of the Cub Scouts compared to the DIA, but the DIA mostly has followed its rules and stayed out of the United States. The CIA does. The CIA was more directly influenced by the Nazis, and is the people that I know are of the belief that, again, whatever they think is appropriate to do, they will do. And you do not have to be overly aware of, you don't have to be a part of the CIA to see the consequences of the CIA. that the game plan that they have played out for decades for overthrow of countries, for assassination of leaders, is not very original. It is very consistent. It is a tried and true playbook. I mean, there are rule books that they have on this is how you break down a country. This is how you take out a leader. And I guess in some ways, psychology, again, we're responsible for that because that was the work that was done in the 1940s. And it doesn't change. I mean, the human beings have not changed in how to control them and manipulate them and assassinate them. And you only have to undergo the experience once to realize that, if you thought you were pretty smart about it, you can't let your guard down one iota, or you will be the next person that's taken out. And, I can speak to that personally, and I think Donald Trump can speak to that personally.
Agreed on that. All right, we have a caller, and then I've got a couple more questions, one on the DOD, but let's take the caller. Leighton, we're ready.
All right, let me bring him right in. Hey, Bob, you are live with the Wellness Crusaders. What is your question for them?
My question is, does Dr. Fleming think if Kennedy becomes part of cabinet, will he be able to rein in some of the deep state agencies like the NSA, the FBI? I think part of the reason that they dislike both of the men so much is because they play outside the system.
Good question.
I think if Robert Kennedy Jr., were to be put into a cabinet position, he is going to have to be very, very careful. I think that either Bobby Kennedy or myself being on the cabinet is not going to be warmly welcomed by the CIA or other government agencies. So the most concerning time will be the initial time. Can it be done? And the answer is yes, it can be done. Is there a risk to either one of us as a result of that? There most definitely is. I can't speak for Bobby. I can speak for myself in that, given everything that I've been up against, it's a risk I'm willing to take. And I suspect that Bobby is willing to take it also. And it's very clear that Donald Trump is willing to take it. And I think Gabbard is willing to take it. And I think that the four of us together would be something that would, on day one, just the thought of the four of us being there would cause a lot of these people to start shredding and burning documents like crazy. But it will not save them from the end result.
I said, well, let's hope that comes to pass. Thank you for that.
Thank you for calling in. That was a great question. So back to
Thank you, Bob.
Back to our last final questions. Then I want to spend a minute talking about your book, Is COVID-19 a Bioweapon? Your newest book, and also about our veterans right now and not being able to find good, clean, healthy food. Your opinion on the DOD, trust them or no?
So the men and women who serve in our military, I trust. The upper leaders, the upper echelon, I do not. No good military leader looks forward to going to war or creating war. No good military leader violates the Constitution of the country that they serve. And the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty and the federal laws make it a criminal act to make biological weapons. You cannot justify the right of doing that and claim that you're really upholding the oath that you took to serve and uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. So any leader that is involved in that is not somebody that I would trust. That's why I say Tulsi Gabbard would be a good person to be in charge of the DOD, because as somebody who has been involved with the men and women on the ground, and I back the U.S. military more than 100%. I know that people like to say 110, but again, 100% is everything. I spent more than half of my medical career taking care of military men and women, and I was a part of that group that issued a report on what type of care the U.S. military was receiving, and helped put that report that was scathing, a couple of decades ago. Because they were getting pathetic care. So I don't trust the upper echelons that are controlling some of this. I trust the men and women of the United States military implicitly. The vast majority of them are good, outstanding American citizens that believe in what they thought of as a kid, which was they were going to defend their country and do a very honorable thing. And I think every one of them should be recognized as heroes. They are the American heroes. They are.
I agree, and thank you for putting that out there. So let's talk about this. Make America Healthy Again. Because you wrote the book Stop Inflammation Now, and your inflammothrombotic theory is in the medical literature.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh, no, don't do that.
Our military, our veterans are in trouble. You know that I'm a big advocate of amino acids. You actually gave me permission to put together your patent Dragon Glass, which is pure amino acids. And amino acids, 21, 9 of them our body doesn't make. It's hard to find those 9 in the food that is now being grown because our food is toxic. The soil is dirt. There's so much chemical spraying going on that it's harming our families, harming our immune system. But we take a look at the veterans who are walking the streets, looking for places to live, living in a PTSD world, being fed shit food, and I don't say that lightly, because none of that food has any nutrition whatsoever. Our veterans who fought for my freedom, your freedom, Leighton's freedom, my husband's freedom, my family's freedom, they are suffering, and they can't get what they need. They don't need more big pharma medicine, because we all know that big pharma has a place in the world, but not necessarily healing the brain when you're lacking nutrients from the food. If you were asked to be part of Trump's cabinet with RFK and others, would you be willing to take the stance and speak up, speak out on big pharma and big ag, and how big ag is poisoning us, pretty much like we've talked about, like through this eugenics, being fed this poison? Would you be willing to walk up on the stage? Would you be willing to say, yes, I will? Or do you feel it wouldn't be your place if you were asked to be part of the cabinet?
Well, so just to be clear, yes, I will what?
Would you be willing to speak up against what big pharma is doing? More importantly, what big ag is doing to our food?
Right,
because
okay,
our
got it.
veterans right now are suffering, and big pharma is not their answer.
Right. So I'm a believer in drugs being used when they are appropriate. But I am also a believer that the vast majority of the health problems that exist in the United States or other countries are a direct reflection of lousy diets, lousy lifestyles. So I would, if I were to take a position, it would be as Secretary of Health and Human Services, under which would be the FDA NIH, and all the rest. And I would call for several things. I would call for one, an evaluation of what's going into all of our foods, and for us to apply the same standards that the Europeans do, because this concept of reasonably acceptable additives to our food is not acceptable. Just because big industry in whatever capacity wants to say, oh, it's great to have it in there, it's great. It's a processing of our food. We know that these processed foods are loaded with fats, sugars, none of the nutritional components they need. We know it increases consumption of food, roughly 500 calories a day, which produces all of these inflammatory thrombotic response diseases. So I know I'm doing the long way, but I want to make sure that I've got this clear for people on the record. I would call for a reevaluation of this, what's called GRAS evaluation, to bring us back to the federal government deciding and making industry prove that something is beneficial to be in a food versus just something they want to have in a food. We would have to phase that in, because if we pulled everything off the market right now, there'd be a lot of starving people, but we would be phasing it in over a 6 to 12 month period of time. If industry can't gear up in 6 to 12 months, we need different people in our industry, because that's pathetic. But I think that's a reasonable amount of time. On the FDA aspect, I would call for a reevaluation of a number of drugs that are already out there. We pull twice as many drugs off the market as we put on the market every year, which means the job is not being done correctly. We would have an immediate moratorium on any eugenic vaccine product on the market. These would not be injected into animals. They would not be injected into people. And we would start an accountability of what's happened over the last 4.5 years. We would immediately, I would work with the Secretary of Agriculture on the prospect of getting these chemicals out of our foods, out of our fields, and allowing farmers to learn how to farm again without the addition of toxins being added to the food. Because once it's added to the food, it cannot be removed. You cannot scrub hard enough on a peach to get the toxins out of it. By the time you do, you're down to the pit, and that's not good for you. We would reevaluate the water sources that are in this country. We have spent 200, is it million or billion? I can't even remember, in the Ukraine. I think it's million, but I don't remember which one of those numbers it is, sadly enough. On the Ukraine, when we should be spending it on our infrastructure, and that includes our water systems, so that our pipes that are corroded do not become the pipes of Rome, where it was so toxic that the people were eating lead and iron out of the pipes. And I would pull the fluoride out of the water at this point in time, because there's been no evidence that the addition of fluoride in the water has done anything for the bone structure of kids throughout this country. I would call for an evaluation on the vaccine drug schedule. And I would take us immediately back to the 1964 vaccine drug schedule. I know that may not make you happy in totality, but I would take it back to the 1964 drug schedule, which I think was 7 vaccines. And I would call for real research to be done on these and to split them out in such a way that if they're given, a child could actually form an immune system. I would call for an immediate evaluation, because I am aware on both sides of the discussion about the autism evaluation on these vaccines. I have seen data that says yes. I have seen data that says no. That is a problem for me as a research scientist, because as a research scientist, science is either, it will take you down one pathway or another, but if you are getting conflicting results, it means you are missing something. And if we are missing something, we should not be injecting it into human beings, because it causes an inflammatory thrombotic response. As far as our veterans are concerned, I would be working with the Veterans Administration Agency and Housing because there should not be a single instance of an American soldier coming out of the U.S. military that does not have housing and food provided to him or her. Every one of those people, when you go into a combat zone, and Mr. Waltz has not, Mr. Vance has. If you go into a combat zone or you see a military situation, it will change who you are, in the same way that if you are an emergency medicine technician or a paramedic and you come upon an ambulance, it will change who you are. In the same way, if you are a doctor or a nurse and you've seen people in the hospital with trauma or injuries or myocardial infarctions or strokes or whatever, it will change who you are forever. When our military men and women return from service, they should not be traumatized to the extent that they become dysfunctional. They should have housing, they should have decent food, and they should be reintegrated back into our society. We just don't put them in housing or give them food and say, that's it, now we're done with you. We actually work with these people. They stood up for us in whatever situation we put them in. It is our responsibility to hold true to the promise that we gave each and every one of them when they went into the military. And
Amen.
finally, it is time we quit sending men and women from the United States to never-ending wars around the world and to quit funding never-ending wars around the world, because I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said, there is nothing good in war except its ending. It doesn't mean that that's completely off the table, but we have spent all but a dozen years of the U.S. history engaged in wars around the world, and it's time we stop.
I love it. That is a good place to end. We have to figure out where we are with the crap food. We have to figure out how do we get healthier food and better supplements to our veterans, because they are suffering not only from PTSD, but some of the other things that they could have lived through. And
When you
all the injections that they got as well in the military.
when we look at food, go look at food. Processed food tends to be cheaper than non-processed food.
Correct.
So explain to me why something that has to be processed, you have to do more to it, which means there should be more expense, is cheaper than the whole food that you didn't have to do anything to. Explain to me why, normally if you add work to something, the price goes up. The fact that they have processed the food and it is cheaper than whole food or good food for you means they are taking advantage of everybody who's trying to watch the dollar, especially people that are homeless or houseless, especially our veterans, especially people that have multiple kids. We have a situation where we are allowing them to leverage our health so that we will buy the less expensive food item with the premise that we're feeding our families, causing the inflammatory thrombotic response diseases that then require that we select drugs from big pharma. That continues a cycle that causes a deterioration in the health of the country. If you want a healthy, vibrant workforce, you don't get one by poisoning it. And it doesn't matter whether we talk about this in the form of food or anything else. When you do something that harms the health, the minds, and the spirits of your people, you are crippling your people and they can no longer be as productive. It has long been argued that one of the reasons why the United States has prospered so much is because we have provided a country with the best opportunities, and the best and brightest people step forward and help bring everybody along. Poisoning our country is not the way to do that. It's time to end it.
It's the trade secret poisons that end up chemically raping our bodies. And there's not enough people that know that these chemicals are in the food, but they start in the soil. Last question before we end. Why did you write your newest book, Are We the Next Endangered Species?
The purpose of writing it was severalfold. There is a lot of misinformation. And from my perspective, now, what, 56, 57 years research and 39 of medicine and 10 of law. As I look at most people, I realize that there is this big gap of information and this polarization between groups of people, some of whom are trying to help and some of whom are taking advantage. And this happens every time that there's a problem that comes up. And I watch it. Simple answer. All I have to do is think of, if I asked my mother and father, they would have said I needed to do something about it. Educating people, explaining information that I realize they may not grasp the first time, or they may not want to read about history because it's not their thing, right? But if it's done in a way, and I've spent my life teaching, if it's done in a way that allows people to engage in it, whether that's putting it out there in a book that's thick enough to use as a paperweight on anything, or the QR codes that allow people to go to the computers and learn. If it's done in a way that allows them to learn at their own pace, and it's not condescending, like many textbooks are today, they write down to the person. I'm not writing down to the person, I'm writing to the person. And I believe that no matter how deep into a subject I go in this book, everybody can wrap their brains around this. Now, everybody's going to do it at different levels, but that's true of just about every book that's worth reading. The first time you read it, you're going to get less out of it than the second and the third and the fourth time. So it's providing that information so that it's that aha moment, so that people can read it and say, I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what it was. I had this gut feeling something was wrong. Now I get it. Now it's beginning to make sense. And it also has chapters in it that don't just give you that warm, fuzzy feeling of, okay, now you have it. It answers the next question. What do we do about it? How are we going to handle this so that this is not the never-ending story of the United States or planet Earth? How are we going to hold these criminals accountable? How are we going to go after the eugenic genetic vaccines? What types of laws do we really need to put into place so that the federal government of the United States abides by the Constitution of the United States, which we shouldn't have to tell them to do, but apparently we do? And how can we, more importantly, in addition to making America healthy again, bring us together again? Because unlike, and I know we don't want to talk politics, but I'm going to for a moment, unlike Kamala Harris, who says she wants to bring us all together again and then spends a debate dividing.
Agreed.
We actually should be able to bring the United States back together again, because I think if I were to ask most people what's important to them, it's their family, whether it's their children or their spouse or their or somebody in their family. It's their family. They care about their family. If you take people that can't feed themselves, I don't care if they're from Haiti or Los Angeles, and they can't feed themselves and they watch starving family members, you should expect that they are going to try to do what they can to feed their family members. We have a problem, but we also have a commonality there, because once we accept the fact that this holds us together stronger than anything else, and when we are in this country, like other people feel in their countries, a unity by being Americans or being Germans or being Russians, doesn't matter. A unity of people hold them together when they quit attacking each other and they say, we're going to work together as a country. Trump, Kennedy, Gabbard, myself, can help that happen. And I'm sure there are a lot of other Americans that would like to join on board, because I think most of us are tired of being at each other's throats. We're tired of being told that we're constantly looking at each other as enemies, when I don't think we are, by and large. By and large, we're just a lot of very frustrated people that have been polarized by people that have been playing us for way too long. This book explains who's been playing us so that we can get a handle on our country and our lives.
Thank you on that. So final comment. I'd like to finish up by reading a short sentence from the book you wrote, Stop Inflammation Now, which is still my favorite book. Every doctor, I believe, should have that in their office and should be reading it. But that comment, and it's kind of like what you just talked about, you said we weren't working together and no one wanted to credit their colleagues with anything. So the researchers working with cholesterol ignored the work on homocysteine, and the homocysteine people ignored the work on fibrinogen. The fight to determine who was right took precedence over finding the truth. And I still see that happening today. So thank you for that clarification. So, Dr. Fleming, you have researched and published so much data on heart disease and SARS-CoV-2, the disease. You are literally one of the most brilliant doctors that I've ever met. Why should the doctors who aren't following you be following you and using your research? And then wrap that answer up with whatis10letters.org.
Well, the reason for using that research is it's designed to answer fundamental questions to help make Americans and the people around the world healthier again. It's not that I set out to prove a point. I've just simply been following where the research takes me. It's not, you're not going to get an opinion out of me. You're only going to get the facts. And I've had people show up at conferences, and I'm sure I've told you this before, where they will say, well, that's not, Dr. Fleming, that you didn't, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that's not what you were saying. And okay, well, if you want to know what I'm going to say in 5 or 10 more years, come back and listen to me, because I don't know what it's going to be yet, because I don't know where the data is taking us. You know, the work on inflammothrombotic response disease, that's built on the work of other people. That was me taking my work and other people's work and simply integrating it together into an explanation that has borne the test of time. The patent FMTVDM, that patent, as I was explaining to people last week in Austin when I was presenting the AI component of it, that patent is the only patent that can measure the changes inside our body, the tissue and metabolic changes inside our body that differentiate every disease, every health problem we have. It allows us for the first time to find problems earlier, to try treatment options that might be less toxic, and to actually show you whether the person gets better for that health problem with that treatment. It's not my treatment, it's whatever the patient and the doctor decides upon. The data will show what the outcome is. Those tests in the licenses that I have are capped. They're not run amok. I could make a potential mass fortune by selling this to some big tech company and letting them run amok and drive the prices up. But I won't do that. I am holding for the situation where it can be used across the board to cap the costs of tests, which have run away and skyrocketed this system so that we can find what works. That is a gift from all that work that's there to help everybody if it's something they want to use. That's a reason for following. It's not me trying to become rich. Certainly, I'm not writing books because I'm trying to become rich. This is not a method for a research scientist to become rich. I think probably if you're writing a novel or something else, you could probably do pretty well that way. But my books don't, make $100 million or even $1 million or even $100,000. So the motive and the intent behind what people are doing is critical. I tell people when they have ideas or thoughts about drug treatments, we should test it. Instead of being offended with that, that I think should be embraced. Because if you have a good idea and you can't prove it, or you can't learn what works and what doesn't work, then your good idea doesn't help anybody. And if you have a bad idea, I would argue that most people would want to know that before somebody's hurt. This method allows that to be done. It's not a decision by me, it's a decision by real science, not by opinions, not by somebody who's been paid off by people with money, or big pharma or big ag or any of the military industrial complex parts. This is about trying to come together to, in a healthy way, stop the disease, figure out what works for each person, get them back to off the medicines as rapidly as possible. And if we can't, then we can't, but at least make them better and quit putting garbage into their body, perpetuating the disease, and work together. I'm trying to give a voice for physicians across the board. Whether they like me or not, I'm literally fighting in this book and in the conversations I've had for them to have a voice in the conversation, and for them to step up and be mature enough to go, I can't prove that. But you're right. I'd like to, because I think it might. And if it might, wouldn't you like me to be able to do that? And my response would be, of course I would, because if you're right, I would want us to learn from that and to help people. And if you're wrong, I would want you to learn from it and not walk away with your tail between your legs, but do what I've done for the vast majority of my research and say, what is this information telling me? How can I do better? And with the course of time, you do better and you come up with new ideas that you wouldn't have even thought of had you not been put through the process of learning. This is about making America healthy again. It is about making America great again. It's about bringing all of us together and working together instead of separating off in our little corners, refusing to look at what anybody else is putting together, and making the world a better place to be in. If there's anything that I can do that would make my parents proud or my children proud, that would be it. And that's all I'm shooting for.
I love it. And 10letters.org?
And 10letters.org is one of those answers provided in the book. We have people who have not, from their view, they are adamant that they're going to do what they're going to do because they think that they know what's best for everybody. And the process of their doing what's best is they have built biological weapons that have killed and maimed people around the world. And if you think of Nazi Germany as a bad outcome, what we went through in the last 4.5 years was more devastating than what the Nazis put everybody through from 1941 to 1945. 10letters.org allows American citizens to go on there, put in your name and address by saying, build my letter. And now I'm just simply going to say, build one for every governor and attorney general. Put an address, put your name in there, put an address, and put every state. And build one for every governor and every attorney general, download it, and then mail it to every one of them. And you can click to hide your address with that little box that's there. So you don't have to take and deal with anybody saying, well, bad you for doing that. Because my answer is bad you for not doing that. Because we all know somebody who's been killed or maimed by this last 4.5-year fiasco of these viruses and the genetic coding of these viruses and the eugenic genetic vaccines. Build the letters, send them in, tell other people to build the letters and send them in, because this is a direct petition to the attorney generals and the governors in each of the 50 states to investigate with the material that's available to them, that's in the cover letter and that's available in the links to the cover letter, to investigate and prosecute anybody that they think is responsible for building these biological weapons. We've laid out the data for you. We've laid out the cover letter for you. We have USB drives and DVDs and books to lay out the evidence for anybody who wants to do it. If we do not hold these people accountable, there is no election. There is no border wall that can keep out biological weapons. There is no law that will prevent the biological weapons from being built, because we already have these, if we don't hold them accountable for breaking the laws that they've built. There is no race, no religion, no group, no city protected from it. We have been through a very challenging 4.5 years, with many people hearing terms they've never heard of before, watching people they love get sick, isolated from people they wanted to see, missing funerals, missing loved ones, losing loved ones, watching their family members now maimed from the injuries. We have all been affected by this. That is another commonality we have. People we know and care about have been hurt and maimed and killed. And we need to hold these criminals accountable. We need to remove them out of our government, where they've had unlimited access to funds, unlimited labs, and uncontrolled, unrestrained access to anything they wanted.
Thank you for that, Dr. Fleming. Thank you for that wrap up. And, you know, President Trump would be blessed to have you and RFK in his cabinet. And so my hope and prayer is that that will happen, because I know that you are one of the doctors for fighting to save America and make America healthy again. So thank you for all your work, and good night for now.
Thank you. Have a good evening.